Persecution of Muslims is the religious persecution inflicted upon the followers of the Islamic faith. This page lists incidents of ethnic cleansing in both medieval and modern history in which Muslim populations have been targeted by non-Muslim groups. For persecution of Muslims by other Muslim groups, see Shia-Sunni relations. Medieval. See also Shahid early Islam. According to Islamic religious tradition, the new Muslims were often subjected to abuse and persecution by the pagan Meccan in the early days of Islam at Mecca. Some were killed, such as Sumayyah bint Kabib, the seventh convert to Islam, who was allegedly tortured first by Amr ibn Hisham. But even Muhammad was subjected to such abuse while he was praying near the Kaaba. Kaaba bin Mu'ayt threw the entrails of a sacrificed camel over him, and Abu Lahab's wife Jamil would regularly dump filth outside his door, and placed thorns in the path of his house. Accordingly, if free Muslims were attacked, slaves who converted were subjected to far worse. The master of the Ethiopian Bilal ibn Rabah would take him out into the desert in the boiling heat of midday and place a heavy rock on his chest, demanding that he forswear his religion and pray to the polytheists' gods and goddesses, until Abu Bakr bought him and freed him. Crusades. The First Crusade was launched in 1095 by Pope Urban II, with the stated goal of regaining control of the sacred city of Jerusalem and the Holy Land from the Muslims, who had captured them from the Byzantines in 638, and who by 1050 destroyed the main Christian shrines and churches in Jerusalem. The Muslim leader, al-Hakim of Cairo, blew up the ancient and magnificent Constantine Church of the Holy Sepulchre in 1009, as well as most other Christian churches and shrines in the Holy Land. This, in conjunction with the Muslim slaughter of Germanic pilgrims traveling to Jerusalem from Byzantium, raised the anger of Europe, and inspired Pope Urban II to call on all Catholic rulers, knights and gentlemen to liberate the Holy Land from Muslim tyranny. It was also partly a response to the investiture controversy, which was the most significant conflict between secular and religious powers in medieval Europe. The controversy began as a dispute between the Holy Roman Emperor and the Gregorian papacy and gave rise to the political concept of Christendom as a union of all peoples and sovereigns under the direction of the Pope. As both sides tried to marshal public opinion in their favor, people became personally engaged in a dramatic religious controversy. Also of great significance in launching the crusade were the string of victories by the Seljuk Turks, which saw the end of Arab rule in Jerusalem. On the 7th of May 1099, the Crusaders reached Jerusalem, which had been recaptured from the Seljuks by the Fatimids of Egypt only a year before. On the 15th of July, the Crusaders were able to end the siege by breaking down sections of the walls and entering the city. Over the course of that afternoon, evening and next morning, the Crusaders killed almost every inhabitant of Jerusalem, Muslims and Jews alike. Although many Muslims sought shelter atop the Temple Mount inside the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Crusaders spared few lives. According to the anonymous Gesta Francorum, in what some believe to be one of the most valuable contemporary sources of the First Crusade, the slaughter was so great that our men waded in blood up to their ankles. Tancred claimed the temple quarter for himself and offered protection to some of the Muslims there, but he was unable to prevent their deaths at the hands of his fellow crusaders. According to Fulcher of Chartres, indeed, if you had been there you would have seen our feet colored to our ankles with the blood of the slain. But what more shall I relate? None of them were left alive, neither women nor children were spared, during the First Crusade and the massacre at Jerusalem. It has been reported that the Crusaders circled the screaming, flame-tortured humanity singing, "Christ we adore thee," with their crusader crosses held high. Muslims were indiscriminately killed, and Jews who had taken refuge in their synagogue were killed when it was burnt down by the Crusaders. Italy. The island of Sicily was early on targeted by the Muslims, the first raid occurring in 652, only a few years after the establishment of the first Muslim navy. Following the onset of Muslim attacks against North Africa, it became a crucial strategic base, and for a while, in 661 to 668, it was the residence of the imperial court under Constans II, constituted as a theme around 690. Its governing strategos also came to assume control over the scattered imperial possessions in the southern Italian mainland. The island was raided thereafter, especially in the first half of the 8th century, but did not come under serious threat until the Muslims completed their conquest of North Africa and moved into Hispania as well. Sicily had been raided by the Muslims since the mid-7th century. With the aid of reinforcements from Ifriqiya and Al-Andalus, in 831 they took Palermo, which became the capital of the new Muslim province. The fall of Palermo marks a decisive step in the Muslim conquest of Sicily. The Muslims gained not only an important military base, but possession of the city, henceforth known simply as Al-Medina, allowed them to consolidate their control over the western portion of the island. The city suffered greatly during the siege. The Arab historian Ibn al-Atiyah records with exaggeration that the city's population fell from 70,000 to 3,000, who were taken as slaves. The fall of the last major Byzantine fortress, Taormina, in 902, is held to mark the completion of the Muslim conquest jihad of Sicily. At first, the Muslim populations did well in Sicily in the first 100 years after the Norman conquest, which ended their colonial emirate of Sicily. Arabs remained privileged in the matters of government. Indeed, 4,000 Saracen archers took part in various battles between Christian forces. When the Normans and later the House of Anjou lost control of the island to Peter of Aragon, Islam began to decline. Norman rulers followed a policy of steadily Latinization. Some Muslims chose the option of feigning conversion, but such a remedy could only provide individual protection and could not sustain a community. Lombard pogroms against Muslims started in the 1160s. Muslim and Christian communities in Sicily became increasingly geographically separated. The island's Muslim communities were mainly isolated beyond an internal frontier which divided the southwestern half of the island from the Christian northeast. Sicilian Muslims, a subject population, were dependent on royal protection. When King William the Good died in 1189, this royal protection was lifted, and the door was opened for widespread attacks against the island's Muslims. Islam was no longer a major presence in the island by the 14th century. Toleration of Muslims ended with increasing Hohenstaufen control. Many repressive measures, passed by Frederick II, were introduced in order to please the popes who could not tolerate Islam being practiced in the heart of Christendom, which resulted in a rebellion of Sicily's Muslims. This in turn triggered organized resistance and systematic reprisals and marked the final chapter of Islam in Sicily. The rebellion abated, but direct papal pressure induced Frederick to mass transfer all his Muslim subjects deep into the Italian hinterland, to Lucera. In 1224, Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II, responding to religious uprisings in Sicily, expelled all Muslims from the island, transferring many to Lucera over the next 2 decades. In this controlled environment, they could not challenge royal authority and they benefited the crown in taxes and military service. Their numbers eventually reached between 15,000 and 20,000, leading Lucera to be called Lucera Saracenorum because it represented the last stronghold of Islamic presence in Italy. During peacetime, Muslims in Lucera were predominantly farmers. They grew durum wheat, barley, legumes, grapes and other fruits. Muslims also kept bees for honey. The Lucera colony thrived for 75 years until it was sacked in 1300 by Christian forces under the command of Charles II of Naples. The majority of the city's Muslim inhabitants were slaughtered or, as happened to almost 10,000 of them, sold into slavery, or exiled, with many finding asylum in Albania across the Adriatic Sea. Their abandoned mosques were demolished, and churches were usually built in the place, including the Cathedral of S. Maria della Vittoria. Mongol invasions. Genghis Khan, and the following Yuan emperors in China forbade Islamic practices like halal butchering, forcing Mongol methods of butchering animals on Muslims, and other restrictive decrees continued. Muslims had to slaughter sheep in secret. Genghis Khan directly called Muslims slaves, and demanded that they follow the Mongol method of eating rather than the halal method. Circumcision was also forbidden. Toward the end, corruption and the persecution became so severe that Muslim generals joined Han Chinese in rebelling against the Mongols. The Ming founder Zhu Yuanzhang had Muslim generals like Lan Yu who rebelled against the Mongols and defeated them in combat. Some Muslim communities had the name Kamsia, which, in Hokkien Chinese, means thank you. Many Hui Muslims claim it is because that they played an important role in overthrowing the Mongols and it was named in thanks by the Han Chinese for assisting them. The Muslims in the Samu class also revolted against the Yuan dynasty in the Ispah rebellion, but the rebellion was crushed and the Muslims were massacred by the Yuan loyalist commander Chen Yuding. Following the brutal Mongol invasion of Central Asia under Genghis Khan, and after the sack of Baghdad, the Mongol Empire's rule extended across most Muslim lands in Asia. The Abbasid Caliphate was destroyed and the Islamic civilization, especially Mesopotamia, suffered much devastation and was replaced by Tengriism or Buddhism as the official religion of the empire. However, the Mongols attacked people for goods and riches and not because of their religion. Many later Mongol Khans and rulers became Muslims themselves, like Uljachu and other Ilkhanid and Golden Horde rulers and inhabitants. There was no real effort to replace Islam with any other religion, but to plunder goods from anyone that didn't submit, which was characteristic to Mongol warfare. During the Yuan dynasty that the Mongols founded, Muslim scientists were highly regarded and Muslim beliefs were respected in the Yuan dynasty. On the Mongol attacks, the Muslim historian Ibn al-Athir lamented. Among the detailed atrocities include the Grand Library of Baghdad, containing countless precious historical documents and books on subjects ranging from medicine to astronomy, was destroyed. Survivors said that the waters of the Tigris ran black with ink from the enormous quantities of books flung into the river. Citizens attempted to flee, but were intercepted by Mongol soldiers who killed with abandon. Martin Sicker writes that close to 90,000 people may have died. Other estimates go much higher. Wassafe claims the loss of life was several hundred thousand. Ian Frazier of The New Yorker says estimates of the death toll have ranged from 200,000 to 1 million. The Mongols looted and then destroyed mosques, palaces, libraries, and hospitals. Grand buildings that had been the work of generations were burned to the ground. The caliph was captured and forced to watch as his citizens were murdered and his treasury plundered. According to most accounts, the caliph was killed by trampling. The Mongols rolled the caliph up in a rug, and rode their horses over him, as they believed that the earth was offended if touched by royal blood. All but one of his sons were killed, and the sole surviving son was sent to Mongolia. Hulagu had to move his camp upwind of the city, due to the stench of decay from the ruined city. At the intervention of the Mongol Hulagu's Nestorian Christian wife, Doku's cartoon, the Christian inhabitants were spared. Hulagu offered the royal palace to the Nestorian Catholicos Mama Kika, and ordered a cathedral to be built for him. Ultimately, the seventh ruler of the Ilkhanate dynasty, Mahmud Ghazan, converted to Islam from Tengrism. and thus began the gradual trend of the decline of Tengrism or Buddhism in the region and renaissance of Islam. Later, 3 of the 4 principal Mongol Khanates embraced Islam. Iberian Peninsula Arabs relying largely on Berbers conquered the Iberian Peninsula starting in 711, subduing the whole Visigothic kingdom by 725. The triumphant Umayyads got conditional capitulations probably in most of the towns, so that they could get a compromise with the native population. This was not always so. For example, Merida, Cordova, Toledo, or Narbonne were conquered by storm or after laying siege on them. The arrangement reached with the locals was based on respecting the laws and traditions used in each place, so that the Goths continued to be ruled on new conditions by their own tribunals and laws. The Gothic Church remained in place and collaborated with the new masters. Al-Andalus or Muslim-ruled Iberian Peninsula was conquered by northern Christian kingdoms in 1492, as a result of their expansion taking place especially after the definite collapse of the Caliphate of Cordova in 1031. The coming of the Crusades and similarly entrenched positions on the northern African Almoravids, who took over Al-Andalus as of 1086. Added to the difficult coexistence between communities, including Muslims in Christian-ruled territory, or the Mozarabic Rite Christians, and further minority groups. The Almohads, a fanatic North African sect, pushed the boundaries of religious intolerance during their occupation of Al-Andalus, affecting also the Jews. During the expansion south of the northern Christian kingdoms, depending on the local capitulations, local Muslims were allowed to remain with some restrictions, while some were assimilated into the Christian faith. After the conquest of Granada, all the Spanish Muslims were under Christian rule. The new acquired population spoke Arabic or Mozarabic, and the campaigns to convert them were unsuccessful. They were known as Moriscos and considered new Christians. Further laws were introduced, as on the 25th of May 1566, stipulating that they had to abandon the use of Arabic, change their costumes, that their doors must remain open every Friday, and other feast days, and that their baths, public and private, to be torn down. The reason doors were to be left open so as to determine whether they secretly observed any Islamic festivals. King Philip II of Spain ordered the destruction of all public baths on the grounds of them being relics of infidelity, notorious for their use by Muslims performing their purification rites. The possession of books or papers in Arabic was near concrete proof of disobedience with severe repercussions. On 1 January 1568, Christian priests were ordered to take all Morisco children between the ages of 3 and 15, and place them in schools, where they should learn Castilian and Christian doctrine. All these laws and measures required force to be implemented, and from much earlier. Between 1609 and 1614 the Moriscos were expelled from Spain. They were to depart, under the pain of death and confiscation, without trial or sentence, to take with them no money, bullion, jewels or bills of exchange, just what they could carry. Grand Duchy of Lithuania. The Litka Tatars, also known as Polish Tatars or Lithuanian Tatars, were a community of Tatar Muslims who migrated into the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and became Polonized. The counter-reformation of the Catholic Church in the Grand Duchy led to persecution of Muslims, Jews, and Orthodox Christians. Among the measures taken were banning the repair of old mosques and preventing new ones from being constructed, banning serfdom of Christians under Muslims, banning marriage of Christian females to Muslims, putting limitations on property ownership among Tatars, and the Ottoman-Polish conflict fed into the discriminatory atmosphere against them and led to anti-Islamic writings and attacks. Sikhs and Sikh Empire. Following the Sikh occupation of Samana in 1709, the Sikh army participated in a massacre of the city's residents. 10,000 unarmed Muslim men and women were slain. Following the siege of Sirhind, Banda Singh Bahadur ordered that all men, women and children be executed. All residents of Sirhind, whether they were men, women or children, were all burned alive or slain. In December 1757, Sikhs pillaged the Doab and the city of Jalandhar. During this pillaging, children were put to the sword, women were dragged out and forcibly converted to Sikhism, and mosques were defiled by pig's blood. The body of Nasser Ali was dug out by Sikhs and flesh was thrust into it. Ranjit Singh went to Peshawar and pillaged the city, cut down trees for which the city was famous, burnt the palace of Balahisar and its mosque was defiled. Devan Chand became the first Hindu governor of Kashmir after 1354 AD and enacted dozens of anti-Muslim laws. He raised the tax on Muslims, demolished the Jama Masjid of Srinagar and prohibited cow slaughter. The punishment for cow slaughter was the death penalty without any exception. He abducted all the Pashtun and Uzbek women and infamously sold them at Hyra Mandi, a very popular market in Lahore. Maharaja Ranjit Singh, in lieu of helping Shah Shuja, the grandson of Ahmad Shah Durrani, asked for the ban of cow slaughter in Afghanistan, and with Ranjit Singh's help, Shuja regained the Kabul throne and imposed a ban on cow slaughter in Kabul. Sayyid Ahmed Belvi declared war against Maharaja Ranjit Singh and recruited many Muslims from madrasas. However, the Yusufzai and Muhammadzai Qarwani didn't like his egalitarian ideals and betrayed Sayyid Ahmed Shahid and his army at the Battle of Balakot and supported the Sikh army in the Battle of Balakot in 1831. And Belvi's head was severed by Sikh General Hari Singh Nalwa. Muslims still revered Sayyid Ahmed, however he was defeated and killed in the battle by Sikh forces commanded by Hari Singh Nalwa and Gulab Singh. Raja Agar Khan of Raja Uri was defeated, humiliated by the Ranjit Singh commander Gulab Singh, and was brought to Lahore where he was beheaded by Gulab Singh of Jammu.